Now, we are shifting from our discussion of the Yellow Wallpaper, which in many ways is considered an American Gothic short story because we do have a setting of an isolated ancestral estate. We also have a plot of a mad, insane woman. And we don't have murder like we do in A Rose for Emily, but we do have, in a sense, sort of the idea of a murder of a psyche, because our narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper, sadly, her persona dies by the end of the story. So we have this image of a haunting ghost of sorts. Now, we're transitioning to A Rose for Emily, which also is considered Gothic American literature, but it is specific to Southern Gothic literature. And what's interesting about William Faulkner is he's the father of Southern Gothic literature, not only short stories, but also novels. Now, before we get into our discussion of A Rose for Emily in detail, we do need to look at his biography as we did with Charlotte Perkins Gilman's initial one. Now, you will notice with William Faulkner's biography, he was born in New Albany, Mississippi. Later, his family relocated to Oxford, Mississippi, and most people relate him to Oxford, Mississippi. If you go to Oxford and visit Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, there are even literary classes dedicated completely to William Faulkner's works. As far as a tourist spot in Oxford, okay, there are many individuals who go and visit William Faulkner's grave, and you can smell the aroma of different types of hard liquor, whether it's whiskey or bourbon, because they do pour the liquor on his grave, and so the aroma of the liquor resounds from it. So it's a tourist spot of sorts now. Now, he is known for his connection with the South and also for its criticism of the South as well. Now, you're going to notice as far as his background, his family did have a stake in the railroad business, so there was some financial comfort. He was of the upper middle class sort of socioeconomic ranking. However, his father, Murray, did drink heavily, okay, and he did gamble, and sadly, that was kind of a bit of a strife on his family. His father kind of was out and about with the rougher side of Oxford, while his mother, she was more of the aristocracy or the local nobility. Now, I'm sure when you're hearing this, you're thinking of Miss Emily Grierson, because in many ways, the Grierson family was very similar to Faulkner's family as far as their connection to old money. Sadly, because of his father's gambling, there were some gambling debts that caused the family to have dire straits. So some of that infamy and, wealth, it did dwindle. And we can see the effect that that has on Faulkner's life and later, of course, on Miss Emily's life in his literary work, A Rose for Emily. Now, I want to pause here because I want us to actually look at the literary work, because I wanted you to really see where William Faulkner grew up, his family upbringing, because since he saw this contrasting kind of viewpoint of those who were of the upper classes versus those who were down in, if you want to say, the ditches of this, I guess if you want to describe it as that way, he wanted to paint a truer picture of what the South was becoming. Now, when you think of Southern literature, and we do need to discuss this in relationship to A Rose for Emily, because it is a piece of Southern literature. A piece of Southern literature is American literature from the Southern region of the United States, and it's written usually by writers from the Southern region, or it could be written by writers from other regions, but the setting of the story is in the South. Now, you're going to notice in this listing, most of these characteristics fit with A Rose for Emily. Southern history, a significance of family, especially the family name and wealth associated with it, a sense of community and one's role within it, the region's dominant religion, and we see that really with Protestant, Methodist kind of references. Issues of racial tension, okay? We do have terminology, names that would have been, considered acceptable during the late 1800s, early 1900s, but in today's society, they are considered racial slurs, and we wouldn't use them in reference to Black people, African American people. Also, land and the promise it brings, a sense of social class, the use of Southern dialect. We see these characteristics in A Rose for Emily. Now, what's unique about William Faulkner, as I mentioned, he does create a new genre of literature. Now, he wrote in a time period that was not necessarily the happiest in Americans' history. This was during the American Great Depression, which of course occurred from 1929 to 1933. A Rose for Emily was written in 1931. So that was in the midst of the Great Depression, when the South was in very dire economic straits. Also, their literature was dire at that point. There were really only, two major kinds of literature. As far as literature, you would have either earlier Reconstruction, post-Civil War literature that predominantly focused on the lost cause of the Civil War, and writers lamented, that the South was defeated and its culture was lost, okay? Other writers were critical. They dismissed the nostalgia of the Old South, and they really want to expose the racism and the exploitation of the African Americans, the Black people. William Faulkner wanted to do something unique. He wanted to use fictional work to offer social criticism of his region, the region that he knew. He was born and he was bred there. And in many ways, he wanted to create a setting that showed the conflict between that concept of the Old South versus the New South. The Old South, of course, referencing that romantic, sentimental myth of what the South once was, before the Civil War. The plantation legend, antebellum South. Think of Caucasian Southerners as genteel aristocrats and African American blacks as slaves. That was the image of the Old South. Versus the New South, which was ever evolving and still is, it's this newly evolving identity, which, there's not as many old, strongly upheld values. And most of those older values are perceived as negative ones, obviously such as slavery, but also there's a mourning of some positive traits of the Old South, such as gentility. There's a contrast between those two. Now, I do want to make sure you understand that concept of Gothic writing, since we did mention it some with the Yellow Wallpaper. When you think of Gothic writing, I think probably most of you think, and I have a slide to sort of, help you think of Gothic. You think of likely Edgar Allan Poe. You think of Vincent Price films from like the 60s and 70s, which many of those were based on Edgar Allan Poe's works. You think of the painting American Gothic, or maybe you think of Gothic fashion. But when you think of Gothic writing, again, it is unique to American literature, especially Southern Gothic writing, but we do see it in European culture and British culture as well. But especially in the Southern region, Southern Gothic writing is usually used to explore social issues and reveal like the cultural character of the South. And it's done through supernatural, ironic, or unusual events. Most of our modern horror movies set in the South, they are Southern Gothic when you think about those. I do want you to understand also that there are other concepts that you need to think about in relationship to Southern Gothic literature. Usually you have a Gothic style of writing by a Southern author to unsettle the audience. Essentially, writers like Faulkner, they want us to, see prevailing trends in society, in this case, American society, the American South, and they are trying to unsettle those old ideals in an attempt to guide the New South into a more promising future that's free of its injustices, which in many ways may be racism, may be exploitation, ostracism, financial exploitation, whatever it might be. There's a listing of those that we could discuss. But what's unique, again, is that William Faulkner, he takes this idea of the antebellum home, which we see in A Rose for Emily, and he turns it inside out to show that that image is dying out. And also that image of the, damsel in distress. I know many of you, when you think of Southern literature, you might think of Gone with the Wind, especially the infamy that has been brought to that film recently. Now, as far as Gone with the Wind, you have this image, of course, of Scarlett O'Hara, the damsel in distress who's saved by Rhett Butler, who rides in on his horse. And then you have Mammy, the contented slave. That's what we have with Gone with the Wind. On the other hand, you have William Faulkner, who turns those stereotypes completely upside down. We have a damsel in distress, Emily Grierson. We also have a hero of sorts, Homer Barron, and we have a slave. I wouldn't call him a contented slave because Tobe is from the 1930s. Slavery has been illegal, but he is still an unpaid slave of sorts. He doesn't speak. He doesn't have a voice. You can think of the symbolism, of course, in that. And also notice that Tobe is in servitude up until the moment Miss Emily dies. What does that say about his persona in this particular work? He's not a contented slave. He's not free. He's oppressed until her death. And what's unique about Miss Emily is Miss Emily, in many ways, she is a symbol of the Old South. Notice she is objectified by the town. She's called, again, and this goes into our first question, a fallen monument, a tradition, a duty, a care, a hereditary obligation, okay? She, in many ways, is a remnant of the Old South. And you'll notice that if Tobe is representative of sort of, Black servitude, slavery, the moment Miss Emily dies, he is free. He can escape. He can be gone. So you can see this even bigger as a symbol of the Old South and its ever-changing nature. But also in the plot itself, you can see that William Faulkner turns these stereotypes upon them. We don't have Scarlett O'Hara in A Rose for Emily. We have Emily Grierson. She's mentally ill, and she likely murders her hero. And again, this idea of the hero is Rhett Butler. Rhett Butler and Homer Barron are nothing alike. Homer Barron, we find out he is not a gentleman. He is a Yankee lay person, a worker of construction. He also is someone, there's, kind of rumblings of him being a homosexual. So we don't know his reason for being with Miss Emily. Does he see the big house and he assumes that there's money? Does he have, maybe criminal intentions toward her? And we don't know. Again, that's the suspense of this work. But in either case, he's no hero. He is killed. The damsel is never saved. Okay, so these ideals of old Southern literature, William Faulkner wanted to turn them upside down. And in many ways, he does that because he creates grotesque characters. Now, notice Miss Emily, she is not necessarily a likable person. She's in situations that make her unlikable. She's stubborn. She's stuck in her ways. She's stuck in the past in many ways. She still treats Tobe as a servant, a slave. That shows racial oppression in her character. Very self-righteous. And she is likely a murderess in her murder of Homer. She's deeply flawed. She's grotesque. But again, Faulkner is trying to highlight the unpleasant aspects of the Southern culture, that there are some screwed up values in the Old South that need to evolve themselves to be better in the New South, which that's what we're doing. We're changing, we're evolving to kind of overcome some of the negative stereotypes that we have. I'm sure when many of you say that you're from Mississippi or you live in Mississippi, you have to work against those stereotypes of ignorance to show what a true Mississippian is. Okay, if you think there's a true Mississippian, because there's many different definitions of that from our perspectives. Now, Faulkner does this very much so through his fictional Yakanapatawa County. Now, he has Jefferson, Mississippi, this fictional small town in A Rose for Emily, to represent this microcosm of the South. And as far as the characters, there are many in his other literary works, but just within A Rose for Emily, we have Emily Grierson, Tobe, Colonel Sartoris, the Board of Aldermen, and also the mayor, as well as, all these other characters. And they are a microcosm of the Old South and the transition to the New South and the kind of confrontation and struggle that can go on there. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to look through the reading questions and discuss really how Miss Emily, representative of the Old South, how she fits into this new world, the New South that's ever evolving. So let's look at those in the next video. Thank you.